Basar Shem Kacholi Olam Vaed La 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 Da 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 Ya Da 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 Ya Da 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 Ya Da 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 Ya Da 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 Ya da 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 la 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 bum bum ba dum bum 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 ya da ba da da ya da 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 ya da 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 ya da 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 la 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 ya da 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 ya da 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 ya 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 da dum bum 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 dum bum 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 dum bum bum. Hello, everybody. Great to be back and learning with you. Excuse me, on a Tuesday. Let's do this. Let's light up the darkness. Man, I'm out of my rhythm. 10 days away, and I gotta restart the machine, as it were. That melody, and what you heard was, unfortunately, just a short recording. That's why I had to play it a few times. Was at my son's yeshiva in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. That's how they sing the Ashrei before Mincha, right? Before Mincha, before the afternoon prayer, which is always introduced by Ashrei. Most minions, most places where we do the afternoon prayer, people just say Ashrei quietly and quickly. But I love how my son and all his classmates just sing that out loud with great joy. And I am overjoyed to be back and to be learning with you. I mean, I'm not overjoyed to have left the Holy Land. It's always a little bit sad to leave, but I am overjoyed to be back learning with you. I was very, very inspired. I got to say, the Rebbeim, the rabbis who are teaching my son this year and his gap year and all his classmates, amazing. I mean, they just filled these kids with a love of learning, the adventure of digging into the texts for the truth, connecting with the tradition. I mean, really phenomenal. And I was not a religious Jew growing up. I didn't have the experience of going to a yeshiva, but his rabbis so kindly allowed the parents to really join in, not just sit in the back and audit, as it were, but to be members of the class during the week. And it was great. I mean, I'm just really fired up. And so let's get to it. Who's in the house on a Tuesday as we get back together? Bill in Mid-Missouri. Paula is happy to see me. Yehuda in South Carolina. Bella in Florida. Melissa in Great Neck. Shandor in the Bronx. Guy in Ohio. Bill says, wanted to thank you especially for sharing the teaching on the manna, the reading that we did yesterday. By the way, I just did it before the class myself. I think Nina shared it on the Facebook page. And it's a segula, kind of an understanding that this is something that we can do that's of great benefit, is to read the chapter of the manna, which is from this week's Torah portion, and you read it on this day. So you can look on the Facebook page after the class if you haven't done it, or just Google it, the chapter of the manna. And it's basically about the children of Israel eating the manna in the wilderness and being, unknowing. Right, we're always, all of us, fully dependent on God's kindness and love because we're alive in this world. But they were very conscious of it since they were gathering the manna every morning. And it's understood to read that chapter. Some people read it every day, all year, but particularly on this day during the week of that Torah portion, it's a segula for livelihood. Right, it's a kind of prayer that can help lift all our prayers up a little bit higher. And what can I say? It shows God how much we love him and how much we need him, and how much we would especially love to receive our livelihood without undue hardship or pain. Jonathan in Thousand Oaks, and there Nina just shared the chapter of the manna here in the comments. Also Chaim in Florida, Eve in South Florida, welcoming me back. Thank you so much. Frank in San Pedro, Marjorie in Georgia, welcoming back. Thank you so much. Today's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by my good friend Chaim Marks, in memory of his father, Nachum ben Nachum. Now, when you hear a Hebrew name, Nachum ben Nachum, the first thing you think is, I guess he's Sephardic, because Ashkenazic Jews don't, when in giving Hebrew names, will not, even in non-Hebrew names, won't name a child after a parent if the parent is still alive. So in this case, Chaim is an Ashkenazi Jew like me, but sadly his father's father, his grandfather, died before his father reached his bris, and that's why Chaim's father ended up with the name Nachum ben Nachum. At any rate, Chaim, thank you so much for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. And may Nachum ben Nachum's neshama, his holy soul, have a tremendous aliyah, a great elevation in the world of souls. We say amen. And Chaim, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we say amen. Okay. Right, so we're playing catch up because I was away for 10 days. The last daf that we did together was page 72 here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 7. And we had just done Mishna number 3 here in chapter 7. So we pick it up. And like I said, today we'll do highlights, right? Highlights. We're not going to do whole pages so that we can get caught up. But we'll do highlights from 5 of those pages. I think tomorrow we're going to do like 3 or 4 pages. And, within 3 or 4 days, we'll get back onto the current schedule. So where we left off was discussing this idea of retroactive designation, where you have witnesses testified that a thief stole a sheep or an ox, or something else, but we're generally talking about stealing animals that trigger the 4-fold or 5-fold payment. And so the witnesses came and said that testified that he stole the animal and that he slaughtered the animal. Let's say the same pair of witnesses. And then another 2 witnesses come forward and say, hey, those witnesses that said this guy stole and then slaughtered the animal, which would trigger the 4 or 5-fold payment, those witnesses are liars, and we are testifying that they are liars, and we know they are liars because we saw them in another place at the same time when they claimed to have witnessed what the thief was doing. So they couldn't have witnessed what the thief was doing because, the thief stole in, let's say, Jerusalem, and we saw these witnesses in Tel Aviv on the same day at the same time. So they couldn't have seen what they said they saw. Now, in that situation, we're going to toss out the testimony, and we're also going to say that these witnesses are no longer permitted to testify in court because they've been established as liars. But what if they testified in some other case in the meantime, between when let's say the theft between when what they were testifying about happened and, when the new witnesses were found and brought to court, maybe a lot of time passed, maybe a year or even longer had passed. And in between, those conspiring witnesses have given testimony and other things. Are we going to say that any testimony they give, not only in the future, we're not going to allow them to testify, but we're also going to disqualify testimony they've given in the past? This depends on the principle of retroactive designation that we've also encountered in other places in our journey. For example, with tithing, somebody that has untithed produce and would like to eat it on Shabbos, and you can't separate tithes on Shabbos, but he'll say, okay, I will tithe this on Monday so that I can eat it now, and it will be as if what I separate on Monday was the tithe that I would have separated before Shabbos so that I could eat it now. And so I'm retroactively designating that tithe later. That's an example of where this principle can come up. So we picked this up on 73a, a few paragraphs from the top. Well, actually, I'm not going to read right now. I'm just going to give you a little summaries of places that we're skipping. So we're going to be skipping an area in which Abaya explores retroactive designation in the sense that a pair of witnesses testify regarding theft and slaughter, and then they're rendered conspiring witnesses with regard just to the slaughter. So would we uproot their testimony regarding the theft? And if so, why would the fourfold payment stay or not stay? That's a kind of nuanced and complicated discussion, which we are going to skip over just in the interest of time so that we can get caught up. On 73b, the discussion moves on to separating one testimony from another. So are we going to say that an entire testimony is discredited? When it's discredited, not necessarily in the case of conspiring witnesses, but where it's just proven that it was, done a different way. Are we going to say that everything that a person spoke is his testimony? Or can we say, well, there was this testimony and there was that testimony and part of it is discredited, or let's say part of it is not discredited but disproven. So if we disprove part of the testimony, meaning not that they lied but that they just got it wrong, will we then say that the whole testimony is thrown out? Or can we separate it into parts and say, okay, well, part of it was disproven, the other part, we don't have proof one way or the other, so maybe the witness made a mistake with regards to one thing that he saw, but are we going to say that he made a mistake with regard to all of it? We have that discussion. And then we come up on 73b, a few paragraphs from the top, and we'll start reading. Rav Papa said that we are speaking of a case where the individual changed his mind, right? So what if somebody changes his mind as he's giving testimony? So are we going to separate, are we going to say he changed his mind about part of it or all of it? So says Rav Papa, we're speaking of a case where the individual changed his mind within the time required for speaking a short phrase. Meaning that Rabbi Yosef holds that when one adds to a statement after a pause, even if the addition was made within a short time, it is considered a separate statement, which does not reverse the initial declaration. So this contradicts the explanation given above, according to which Rabbi Yosef maintains that when one adds to an existing statement within the time required for speaking a short phrase, it is considered continuous speech, right? So what we're really talking about is when people pause, and depending on how long a pause, can we separate their testimony into separate parts, or is it all one? And the sages said in response, there are two time frames that are referred to as being within the time required for speaking a short phrase. Right, so what do we call a pause that's long enough for somebody? And this can also be, for example, when somebody makes a vow that, I'm going to set aside this sheep to be an offering. You know what? No, I don't. I'm not going to do that, right? In other words, in the same utterance, he changes his mind. So did the first statement acquire validity? He made a vow and now he has to hold himself up to it. Or because he immediately said, no, what was I thinking? I'm not going to do that. The reversal, would uproot the first statement. That's going to depend on how long the pause was. Was it a complete statement that took hold and his obligation now is rooted in his words? Or it was all one continuous thought and he said, no, I'm not going to do that, right? So how long is the pause? So one way to measure this is the time required for a student to greet a rabbi, and the other one is the time required for a rabbi to greet a student, right? When a student greets his rabbi, that's going to be a longer phrase, a longer greeting than what is required for a rabbi to greet his student, right? So depending on the long measure or the short measure, depending on who holds which way about a pause that interrupts a statement. So does Rabbi Yosef hold that a statement added within the time required for speaking a short phrase is not considered continuous speech, when the words are added within the time required for a student to greet his rabbi. So that's the longer pause. And what is that phrase? Peace be upon you, my rabbi and teacher. Right? That's how you're supposed to greet your teacher. Peace be upon you, my rabbi and teacher. As that, there's Shalom Aleichem, my rabbi and teacher, as that is a long pause. By contrast, if the statement is added within the shorter time frame required for a rabbi to greet his student, which is simply Shalom Aleichem, right? Just peace be upon you. Then Rabbi Yosei is of the opinion that the added words constitute speech that is continuous with the original statement. And in the case of a vow, for example, it would uproot the vow as if it had not been spoken. Now, Rava says witnesses to a capital crime who were first contradicted by two other witnesses, and ultimately they, the first set of witnesses, were rendered conspiring witnesses, right? So, in other words, there's three sets of witnesses here, right? So there's two witnesses that come, and they say, we saw this guy murder another guy. Right? And then two other witnesses come and say, well, that's not what we saw. What it looked like to us was self-defense, or, we saw this guy at a different time. In other words, and so we have two sets of witness testimonies that are contradictory. It's just contradictory. That happens all the time in court, right? That eyewitnesses contradict each other. And then a third set of witnesses comes and says that the first two witnesses, they're the liars, right? Because they're conspiring witnesses. We saw them at a totally different time, at a totally different place at the time when they claimed to have witnessed the murder. And so therefore, now they've been rendered conspiring witnesses. And what is the punishment for conspiring witnesses? It's that they receive the punishment, or they're liable to the damages that would have been imposed on the defendant if those witnesses had not been found to be conspiring witnesses, right? If their testimony had been believed, the defendant would have been punished. And so they're going to suffer that punishment, as we've discussed before. So the nuance that's introduced here is, well, what if it's first rendered contradictory testimony and later it's found to be the testimony of conspiring witnesses? So according to Rava, the fact that it was first rendered contradictory testimony isn't going to matter, right? So if there were first, so witnesses to a capital crime were first contradicted by other witnesses, and ultimately those first witnesses were rendered conspiring witnesses. Well, they are killed because if their testimony had been accepted, the defendant would have been executed because it was a capital crime. So they are liable to the death penalty in accordance with the punishment for conspiring witnesses involved in a capital case. And this is despite the fact that their testimony was already disqualified prior to the discovery of their conspiracy, meaning it was contradicted. And so let's say it was two witnesses versus two witnesses, contradictory testimony. Okay, so the defendant's going to be off the hook because we don't have clear testimony that he's guilty of a capital offense. So nevertheless, when we establish that the first witnesses are conspiring witnesses, they do become liable to the death penalty because that's what they sought to create for the defendant. And the reason is that the contradiction of testimony is the start of determining that testimony is conspiring testimony. Only the process has not yet been completed at the time of the contradiction, right? We have not finished the contradiction. And so at the time that the conspiring witnesses were testifying, they were indeed creating the possibility that the defendant would be executed. Rava said, from where do I say that this is so? As it is taught in a Baraisa, we testify with regard to so-and-so that he blinded his Canaanite slave's eye and afterward knocked out his tooth. And therefore the master is obligated to pay him compensation for the value of his tooth. Right? When you owned a Canaanite slave in ancient times, one of the ways that a Canaanite slave could go free is if the master either put out his eye or knocked out his tooth. So if you do one before the other, well, once the master put out the slave's eye, the slave goes free. And then even though it all happened, like, let's say, pretty quickly, he put out the eye and knocked out the tooth. But automatically the slave became free when the eye was put out. And so now it's like as if a private citizen knocked out the tooth of another private citizen, not master and slave. And that's why he becomes liable to pay damages for the tooth. And we're talking about as a sequence of events. So we testify with regard to so-and-so that he blinded his Canaanite slave's eye and afterward knocked out his tooth, and therefore the master is obligated to pay him compensation for the value of his tooth, as that is what the master says, i.e., this testimony is advantageous to the master, and subsequently they were found to be conspiring witnesses, so they pay the value of an eye to the slave. Because they reversed the testimony. It was in other words, when there's a contradiction, when there's a conflict where they say, okay, that's what happened. The master both blinded the slave and knocked out his tooth. But if it's eye and then tooth, the slave goes free and you owe him the value of a tooth, which is a small amount of money compared to the value of an eye. So if the master knocked out the tooth, slave goes free and then blinded him, now he owes in damages the value of an eye, which is much higher, right? And if so if everyone agrees that both things happened, but what we're arguing about is the order in which they happened, and these conspiring witnesses lied about the order, so then they're going to be liable to, pay in damages what they would have caused the master to pay had they not lied. Now, Rav explains that the Baraisa, as written, is problematic. What are the circumstances of this case? If we say that it is exactly as it is taught in the Baraisa, i.e. that there is no other set of witnesses other than those whose statement is quoted in the Baraisa, and the opposing set of witnesses who establish them as conspiring witnesses, then several problems arise. First, why should they pay the value of an eye to the slave? After emancipating him by testifying that his master had blinded him, should they be required to pay him the value of his eye? And furthermore, they should be required to pay the value of the entire slave to the master, as they intended to cause him to lose ownership of his slave through their false testimony. And furthermore, why does the Baraisa say, and that is what the master says, i.e. this testimony is advantageous to the master? Is it really satisfactory to the master that his slave be emancipated as a result of this testimony? Rather, it must be that this case involves another competing testimony that is not mentioned in the Baraisa. And is it not correct to say that the Baraisa is dealing with a case where prior to the testimonies mentioned in the Baraisa, two other witnesses came and said the master first knocked out the slave's tooth and then blinded his eye, in which case the master is required to emancipate the slave and also to give him the value of his eye. And then an intermediate set of two witnesses came and said that the testimony quoted in the Baraisa, that the first master blinded the slave's eye and then knocked out his tooth. So according to this account, the master would still be required to emancipate the slave, but he would be required to give him only the value of its tooth, which is much less than the value of an eye. In this case, the testimony of the first set of witnesses contradicts the testimony of the intermediate ones. And this is the meaning of the clause, as that is what the master says, i.e., this testimony is advantageous to the master. And it means that what the intermediate witnesses say, i.e., that he owes the value of a tooth, is satisfactory to him, as according to the claim of the first set, he owes the value of an eye. And since there are now contradictory testimonies, the testimony stating the claim of a loss of lesser value is accepted. And in that case, the master would have to pay the slave only for the value of his tooth, in addition to emancipating him. And this judgment corresponds exactly to the testimony of the intermediate set of witnesses. And the Baraisa subsequently teaches, and then the intermediate set of witnesses were found to be conspiring witnesses, as a third set of witnesses testified that the intermediate set was not at the scene of the incident at all. Therefore, the intermediate set of witnesses pays the value of an eye to the slave, less the value of a tooth, as this is the amount of monetary damage the slave stood to incur as a result of their testimony. So Rava concludes his proof, and we learn from the Baraisa that the contradiction of testimony is the start of determining that testimony is conspiring testimony. Although the testimony of the intermediate set of witnesses had already been contradicted, before it was shown to be conspiring testimony, nevertheless, they can still be established as conspiring witness. They can still be established as conspiring witnesses at that later stage, which means that they must pay an amount equivalent to the loss they were attempting to cause through their testimony, right? So in other words, even though even though contradictory testimony comes and makes it, right? Remember, 3 sets of witnesses. The first, and what we're learning about this case of the slave and the tooth and the eye, etc., is to compare it to the case in a capital crime, where first the witnesses say he committed murder, then other witnesses come and say, yeah, we didn't see a murder, so now we don't have clear testimony that murder is what happened here, so therefore the defendant is not subject to the death penalty. But then a third set of witnesses arrive and say, well, those first witnesses are complete liars, so even though through their false conspiring testimony they could not have led to an execution of the defendant because of the contradictory testimony, nevertheless, their attempt would have caused execution of the defendant, and those witnesses are liable to the death penalty of what they would have caused, even though the contradictory testimony would have rendered execution impossible for the defendant. Okay. Then we're going to skip a few more sections, a few more paragraphs, in which Abaye presents a complex set of circumstances, even more complex than what we've been talking about, where the order of events in this, looking at the slave, the master, the eye, the tooth, and when the testimonies came in. So Abaye makes it even more complicated in terms of the order of circumstances of what happened when. It is unlikely, but it is possible to undermine Rava's assumptions thereby. Toward the end of that section, there's just a little bit of background from Rav Steinsaltz. That's always good to remember, that there are several differences between 2 forms of disqualifying testimony of witnesses, right? What we're talking about here, the difference between contradictory testimony and testimony that renders witnesses as conspiring witnesses. So a pair of witnesses are rendered conspiring witnesses if a second pair testifies that they could not have witnessed the events in question because they were not in the place where the incident purportedly transpired. Witnesses who are rendered conspiring witnesses receive the same punishment that they sought to have imposed on the individual concerning whom they testified. In a case concerning contradictory testimony, 2 other witnesses simply state a different version of events. And although the first pair of witnesses is suspected of lying, they are not disqualified from testifying in other cases, and they do not receive punishment. So in this case, the testimony of each pair of witnesses carries equal weight, and consequently, the 2 testimonies neutralize one another. In a case where there's damages in question, and there's 2 sets of contradictory testimonies, but they agree in the sense that, one is according to one testimony, the defendant would have to pay 100 dinars in damages, and according to the other testimony, he'd have to pay 50 dinars. He is going to be liable to the 50 dinars because no matter which testimony was correct, he's going to be liable to pay something. So we go to the lesser amount, not cancel it altogether, and there's no damages. We would just go to the lesser amount. Okay. We pick this up again right at the bottom of page 74a. Rabbi Zera, Nina, I have very dry throat. If you're listening, please bring me a glass of water. I would appreciate it. Rabbi Zera objects to the basic assumption of the Baraisa that when a master inflicts 2 injuries upon his Canaanite slave, he must indemnify the slave for the second injury. So one can say instead that if the master blinded his slave's eye, the slave should go free on account of his eye. And if he knocked out his tooth, he should go free on account of his tooth. And if the master both blinded his eye and knocked out his tooth, the slave should go free on account of both his eye and his tooth, without the master having to pay damages for the loss of either the lesser or the greater or the one that happened second. In other words, the Torah says that a slave will go free if the master puts out his eye or knocks out his tooth. Thank you so much. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shah kol him devaro. Okay. And since the Torah says that he goes out for either of those things, so then why not say, okay, well, both happened, and as a result of both things, the slave is going to go free. Why say that the slave goes free after the first one, and then the master has to pay damages for the second one? That's what Rabbi Zeir is saying. And Abaye said to him in response, and now we're on page 74b, with regard to your claim, the verse states, and if a man smites the eye of his slave or the eye of his maidservant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. Exodus 21:26. And the phrase for his eye's sake indicates, but not for the sake of both his eye and his tooth. And the same can be inferred from the subsequent verse. And if he smites out his bondsman's tooth or his bondswoman's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. And the phrase for his tooth's sake indicates, but not for the sake of both the eye and the tooth. And that's why, if he does both things, the slave will go free on account of one of them, and he has to pay damages for the other. Skip a couple of paragraphs. And this is a matter in the dispute between other Amoraim, sages of the Gemara, before Rava and Abaye discussed it. As it was stated, with regard to witnesses to a capital crime who were first contradicted by two other witnesses and ultimately were rendered conspiring witnesses, this is a matter of dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. One said these witnesses are killed, like all conspiring witnesses in a capital case, as the contradiction of testimony is the start of determining that testimony is conspiring testimony, and the other said they are not killed. And the Gemara suggests it may be concluded that it is Rabbi Elazar who says that they are not killed. As Rabbi Elazar says, witnesses who were contradicted in a case involving the taking of a life, i.e. a capital case, they are flogged for violating the prohibition, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. They're flogged, but they're not killed, as they would have been the case if their testimony had been accepted. And if it enters your mind that it is Rabbi Elazar who says that witnesses to a capital crime who were first contradicted and ultimately found to be conspiring witnesses are killed, why are they flogged in this case? There's always the possibility that they might be rendered conspiring witnesses, which would render them liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment. Consequently, this is a case of a prohibition given as a warning of liability for court-imposed capital punishment. And there's a principle that one is not flogged for violating any prohibition given as a warning of liability for court-imposed capital punishment. Right, in keeping with the principle that either you're going to be executed or you're going to be flogged, not both. Right? If in a case where generally when there's two punishments, you receive the more severe punishment and you're excused from the lesser one. If it's for an action that triggers both punishments, right? If there are two separate actions at separate times, then you can receive both. You can be flogged before you're executed if it's for two different actions. Now, rather, isn't it correct to conclude from this statement that it is Rabbi Elazar who says that witnesses to a capital crime who were first contradicted and ultimately were found to be conspiring witnesses are not killed? And the Gemara affirms, yes, it may be concluded that this is so. And the Gemara asks a question with regard to Rabbi Elazar's opinion that witnesses who were contradicted in a capital case are flogged. Why are they flogged? Simply because their testimony was contradicted. They are two witnesses, and they are contradicted by two other witnesses. What did you see in the testimony of the second set of witnesses that leads you to rely on those witnesses to the extent that the first set of witnesses would be flogged? You could just as well rely on the other witnesses. How can you ever determine with certainty that a given testimony is false merely because it was contradicted by the testimony of other witnesses? And Abaye said the contradiction to which Rabbi Elazar is referring, it involves a case where the witnesses testified that they saw a certain person murdered, and subsequently the individual who was allegedly killed came to the court on his feet, conclusively disproving their testimony. So obviously they must have been liars. That's where you would flog them. They weren't rendered conspiring witnesses by the witness who said where they were at the time they claimed to be seeing something, but clearly they were lying if they said they saw someone murdered, and then he walks into court. Now, presumably you wouldn't flog them if you could come up with some set of circumstances where they simply made a mistake, right? It wasn't because they were lying. It's that they saw what they thought they saw. They were wrong. But it wasn't because they were lying. Now, they would have to prove that there would be a further examination of what the circumstances were. But if we could prove that they were lying, not because they were somewhere else but they claimed to be, but we could establish with certainty that they were lying, like this, then they might be flogged. Okay, and that concludes our discussion of Mishna number 3. Here's Mishna number 4. In chapter 7, if one stole an ox or a sheep, as established based on the testimony of 2 witnesses, and he subsequently slaughtered or sold the stolen animal, as established based on the testimony of 1 witness, or based on his own admission, i.e. he himself admitted that he performed these acts, without there being any witness testimony, he pays the double payment of a thief, but he does not pay the 4-fold or 5-fold payment, right? Because for the 4-fold or 5-fold payment to be triggered, 4-fold if it was a sheep that was stolen, and then he either sold or slaughtered it, or the 5-fold payment if he stole an ox, and then he either sold or slaughtered the ox. In both those cases, both sections, the stealing and then the sale or slaughter, has to be established by 2 witnesses. It doesn't have to be the same 2 witnesses for both the theft and the slaughter or sale, but it has to be 2 witnesses for each segment of the crime, the stealing and then the disposing of the animal, either through a sale or slaughter. So if you don't have 2 witnesses to both elements of the crime, then you don't trigger that 4-fold or 5-fold payment. But since he stole, he is still going to be liable for the 2-fold payment. There's still a penalty for a thief who steals. He not only has to make restitution, he has to double the amount that he stole because he's a thief. Now, if one stole an animal and he slaughtered it on Shabbos, which is a capital offense, or if he stole an animal and slaughtered it for the purpose of idol worship, a capital offense, or if he stole his father's animal and subsequently his father died, and afterward he slaughtered or sold it, or if he stole an animal and subsequently he consecrated it as an offering, and afterward he slaughtered or sold it. In all these cases, the thief pays the double payment, but he does not pay the 4-fold or 5-fold payment because we have an interruption between, the stealing and the sale or slaughter that's going to change the disposition of the case. Rabbi Shimon says, in the case of sacrificial animals for which the owner bears financial responsibility to replace with another animal, if one of the original animals that one stole is lost or dies, so then the thief is obligated to pay the 4-fold or 5-fold payment if he slaughters one of the animals. If it is a sacrificial animal for which the owner bears no financial responsibility, then the thief is exempt from the 4-fold or 5-fold payment. So we discussed this before. If I designate this particular animal to be a sacrifice, I say, I don't have an animal here, so it's just as a teaching example. I'm going to sacrifice that sheep. I'm going to bring it to the temple and sacrifice it as a burnt offering. And then a thief steals that animal. So it's unfortunate for me that I'm not going to be able to bring that animal as a sacrifice, but I'm not obligated to replace that animal. On the other hand, if I make a vow, I hereby vow to bring a sheep as a burnt offering in the holy temple. Then if the thief steals my animal, I have to now go get another animal to replace the one that I had designated because my vow was to bring an animal, not that animal. And so if he steals an animal that I had consecrated and designated only that animal to bring, since I don't still have an obligation to bring another animal, it's a different type of theft than if he steals an animal from a person who had obligated himself to bring an animal and he still has to bring an animal. The Gemara, the Mishnah teaches that if the fact that the thief slaughtered or sold the animal was established based on the testimony of one witness, which was to say not established at all, he is exempt from the fourfold or fivefold payment. And the Gemara asks, is this obvious? And the sages say in response, by stating this case, the Mishnah teaches us the following law. The case of the thief slaughtering the animal, established based on the testimony of one witness, is similar to a case where it is established based on his own admission. Just as in the case where the slaughter is established based on the testimony of one witness, if one other witness comes and corroborates the testimony of the first, so he joins together with the first witness, and together their testimony is rendered a valid testimony of two. And the thief becomes obligated to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment. So too, where the slaughter is established based on the thief's own admission, that would only count as one witness, even though it's a confession. But if his own confession is joined by the testimony of another single witness, now that single witness and the thief himself combine to form the testimony of two witnesses. And if there's also two witnesses to testify that he stole, now the fourfold or fivefold payment has been triggered. We're going to skip an area in the Gemara where there's the interesting case of Rabban Gamliel, who accidentally put out one eye of his Canaanite slave Tavi. And he said this to Rabbi Yehoshua, right? Rabban Gamliel said that that's what happened to Rabbi Yehoshua, and he said it outside of court. And so the question is, did that trigger the emancipation? Remember, even for putting out an eye, etc., to trigger emancipation of a slave, that also has to be established by two witnesses. Now you can say, well, Rabban Gamliel, I mean, he's a judge himself. He's a member of the Sanhedrin. He's the head of the Sanhedrin. And if he says that he did that, isn't that enough to trigger emancipation of the slave? Not necessarily, and that's what that discussion is about, but we're going to move on. So we're going to talk about Rava bar Achilai, who said, what is the reason for a ruling of Rav? Now, with regard to theft, which is subject to a fine of double payment, the Torah states, if the theft shall be found in his possession alive, whether it is an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. That's a standard double payment of a thief who's caught, right? As opposed, if he confesses that he stole, so he has to return what he stole, but he's not going to have to make the double payment. If he gets caught stealing, or he gets caught with what he stole in his possession, that's when the double payment is triggered. How do we know this? The Torah states that the thief shall be found, if the theft shall be found in his possession alive, whether it is an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. Exodus 22:3. So the verb for shall be found is a kind of doubling, where we see in the Torah that a verb is doubled for emphasis. So here it's doubled as himatze timatze. So Rav derives from the repetition that there are two matters that are found. The double payment is imposed only if it is found, chimatze, i.e. it is revealed that he stole the item through the testimony of witnesses, and the theft is found as determined through judges, and this excludes one who incriminates himself through his own admission. So Rav asked, but why don't need the Torah teach this here? This principle is already derived from a different source. The one whom the judges convict shall pay double to his neighbor, which indicates that self-incrimination is insufficient to render one liable for double payment. Rather, conclude from the fact that there are two verses to serve as the source for this example, that one who admits he is liable to pay a fine is exempt from paying, even if afterward witnesses come and testify to his liability. Right, so that would seem to contradict what we said before, that if somebody confesses that he did a crime, so he's one witness, and then a second witness joins him, now we've got the testimony of two witnesses, and he becomes liable to pay the fine. But here what they're saying, well, no, if he confesses, then he is going to be off the hook for the penalty. He still has to make restitution of what he stole, but he's going to be off the hook for the double payment because he confessed. And Shmuel would explain that double expression differently. he would have said to you, the verse is necessary to teach that a thief himself must pay the double payment, i.e. the double payment is imposed not only upon a bailee who takes a false oath that the article entrusted to him was stolen, but it is also imposed upon a thief, as the school of Hizkiah taught earlier in this chapter, right? It's mentioned twice in the Torah. The whole concept is mentioned twice. Once, if a person steals, is caught with the article he stole, he has to make the double payment. And also, if somebody's entrusted to take care of something and he claims that it was stolen from him, and then it is shown that he lied, that it's going to be the same penalty as if he himself stole it. Now, Rav raised an objection to Shmuel from the following Baraisa. If a thief saw witnesses who were approaching with the intent to testify against him, and at that point he said, I admit that I stole an animal, but I did not slaughter or sell it. So he pays only the principal. And this indicates that even if those witnesses subsequently testify, the thief remains exempt from the double payment as well as the fourfold or fivefold payment. And Shmuel said to him in response, with what are we dealing here in this Baraisa? With a case where the witnesses returned back, i.e. meaning ultimately they did not testify. So Rav raised an objection, but this interpretation is impossible, as can be seen from the fact that the latter clause of that Baraisa teaches, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, says, let the witnesses come and testify. And this means that their testimony will be accepted, and the thief will be required to pay the relevant penalty. So by inference, it may be deduced that the first Tana holds that no, there is no point in the witnesses testifying, as the thief will be exempt in any case. So Shmuel said to Rav, isn't there the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, which stands in accordance with my opinion, when I said that one who admits that he is liable to pay a penalty, and afterward witnesses testified that he committed that act, is deemed liable? Well, I said this ruling in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. And the Gemara comments, according to Shmuel, his opinion on this matter is certainly subject to a dispute between Tanaim, the sages of the Mishna, as he himself was forced to admit that his opinion is in accordance only with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, and not that of the first Tana of the Baraisa. But according to Rav, shall we say that this opinion is necessarily subject to this dispute between the Tanaim? And the Gemara explains, Rav could have said to you, I say my opinion in accordance with the rulings of both Tanaim of the Baraisa, even according to the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, says that the testimony of the witnesses obligates the thief to pay a fine, even after his admission only there, in that specific case, because the thief admitted his guilt solely due to his fear of the impending testimony of the witnesses. Otherwise, he wouldn't have admitted it. But here, in a case of an ordinary admission, where there is no impending testimony to incriminate him, and he admits his guilt of his own volition, then even Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, would concede that the thief is exempt from payment, even if witnesses subsequently testify that he is liable. So Rav Hamnuna said, Rav's statement is more reasonable in a case where the thief says, I stole an item, and subsequently witnesses came and testified that he stole that item. In that case, it is logical that the thief is exempt from paying the fine, despite the witness's later testimony, because he at least obligated himself to pay the principal amount via his own admission, seemingly not because he was afraid he would get caught, but because he simply admitted it. But if he says, I didn't steal anything, and then witnesses came and testified that he did steal an animal, and then the thief says, okay, yes, I did steal the animal, and I also slaughtered it, and I also sold it, and then witnesses came and testified that he slaughtered or sold it, he is liable to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment. And the reason is he is liable is that through his admission, he sought to exempt himself from any payment whatsoever. In order for an admission to exempt the perpetrator from a fine, it must include an admission that he is liable to some payment. This guy had two admissions, right? I mean, first he denied it, then he admitted partial. Hold on. Well, no. See, first he denied that he stole, and then it was shown that he had stolen. So then he added, and I stole it. and I slaughtered it, or and I sold it. So what he was saying is, and therefore I'll make the restitution, but I don't want to have to make that fourfold or fivefold payment. And then witnesses came, because I'm admitting it, and then witnesses came and he didn't know that there was going to be witnesses that could show it, that he did it. And now come the witnesses that, established that he did it, not just through his own confession, but by their testimony. He was trying to get out of making the fourfold or fivefold payment, and now it's going to be reinstated. Okay, we're going to skip some more paragraphs on page 75, which explore different variations of this sequence of events where he says, I didn't steal. Then it's established that he did steal. So then he says, yes, I stole, and I also slaughtered. So what payment does he actually make? If there's a partial, uncorroborated admission, does he pay the whole fourfold or fivefold payment? Is he going to just pay the twofold or threefold on top of what he would have already had to make? That gets explored. We are going to skip forward toward the end of 75b, but along the way, a halacha that we would have learned if we had more time is that in a case where two witnesses testify that someone stole an animal and two others testify that he slaughtered it, and the two witnesses testifying to the theft were rendered conspiring witnesses, so the entire testimony is nullified. If only the second set of witnesses, i.e. those testifying to the slaughter, were rendered conspiring witnesses, then the thief still pays the double payment for the theft, and the witnesses who testified falsely concerning the slaughter pay the thief a threefold payment for an ox, as this is the amount that they sought to cause him to pay beyond what he owed anyway. And let's see, and this leads to an important principle. So Sumakos says, where two people come and say to the thief, you stole an animal, and the thief said to them in reply, yes, I did steal the animal, and moreover I slaughtered it, and moreover I sold it, but I did not steal it in your presence, and your testimony that you saw me steal it is false. And subsequently, the thief brought two new witnesses who rendered the original witnesses conspiring witnesses by testifying that they were in a different place at the time they claimed that the theft occurred, thereby proving that the thief did not steal in their presence. He admits that he stole, but not in their presence. And finally, the owner of the animal brought other witnesses who testified that the thief did indeed steal the animal and that he slaughtered it or sold it. And so Sumakos and the rabbis disagree whether an admission to the slaughter of a stolen animal is a valid admission, even though it does not lead to liability to pay any payment. Both parties to the dispute agree that the admission of a perpetrator only in response to the testimony of witnesses is not a valid admission. So that's an interesting principle, that if somebody confesses, but you know that he's only confessing because witnesses were about to testify what he did, so he's trying to get a jump on the witnesses, right? That's not the same as somebody whose conscience leads him to come in and confess. Then they will also explore the idea, very interesting, that with regard to testimony that cannot possibly lead to the punishment designated for conspiring witnesses. Meaning, if witnesses say, we saw this guy steal, and then, the judge asks the witnesses, when did this happen? And the witness says, I'm not sure. It was last week sometime, but I can't remember if it was Monday or Tuesday. Maybe it was Wednesday. That testimony is disqualified, right? Because you could never disprove, or you could never show that these witnesses were conspiring witnesses, because we're not establishing the time at which they say that they were there watching the defendant do what he did. Since they're not sure of the time and place, they could never be established as conspiring witnesses, and we use that to actually disqualify them as witnesses at all, right? There's not going to be any issue of conspiring witnesses, but because they're not sure the time and place of what they saw, when and where they saw it, we disqualify the testimony entirely. We move forward to page 76a. Okay. So the Mishna teaches that if one stole an animal and subsequently And I see that this is taking longer than I thought. So hold on a second, since we are coming up on an hour already. So I think what we'll do is we'll say that today brings us through page 76 rather than page 77. And we'll pick up what we're doing or what we're skipping on page 77 tomorrow. Yeah. Okay, so just doing a little bit more, but today's highlights will end with page 76. Okay, so the Mishnah teaches if one stole an animal and subsequently he consecrated it as an offering, right? So remember, for the fourfold or fivefold payment, you got to steal it, and that needs to be established by two witnesses. And then you either sell it or slaughter it, right? So in both cases, it's going to become impossible to give it back to the original owner, and that's what triggers the fourfold or fivefold payment. Well, what if before you sell it or slaughter it, you consecrate it? So consecrating is not the same as selling. It's not the same as slaughtering, right? It's the saying you're going to give it to the temple. Now, we've talked about this before. Can you consecrate something that is stolen? Generally not, but sometimes yes. So let's see what it says here. So if one stole an animal and subsequently he consecrated it as an offering, and afterward he slaughtered or sold it, so the thief pays the double payment, but he does not pay the fourfold or fivefold payment. And the sages say, granted, he is not liable to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment for the slaughter of the animal, as when he slaughtered it, he slaughtered an animal belonging to the temple treasury, and he did not slaughter the animal belonging to its owner, because it was consecrated. But let him be liable to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment for having consecrated the animal in the first place. As what difference is it to the owner if the thief sold the animal to an ordinary person? And what difference is it to the owner if he sold it to heaven, as it were, right? When he consecrated it, it's like he sold it to heaven. From the owner's point of view, the animal's gone and cannot be returned to him. So why not say that this guy's liable to the fourfold or fivefold payment? And the Gemara answers, in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah taught? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who says that sacrificial animals for which the owner bears financial responsibility to replace with another animal, if one of the original animals is lost or dies, are considered to be in the possession of their owner. And the Mishnah is referring to a case where the thief consecrated the animal in such a manner that he is obligated to replace it if it is lost or damaged before being sacrificed, right? Meaning that the thief said, I hereby obligate myself to bring an offering, and this animal is going to be the offering. So in that case, once he slaughters it, he has to bring another animal as the offering. So one consequence of this potential financial loss is that the animal is considered to be in the thief's possession even after he consecrated it. Therefore, the animal's consecration is not tantamount to a sale to another party. But the Gemara rejects this answer. But from the fact that the latter clause of the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, it follows that the first clause of the Mishnah, which is stated before his opinion is introduced, is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. So rather, with what are we dealing here in the Mishnah? We are dealing with a case where the thief consecrated the animal as an offering of lesser sanctity. And the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, who says that an offering of lesser sanctity is the property of its putative owner and is considered in his possession. Therefore, its consecration is not tantamount to a sale to another party. And therefore, if he slaughters it, we would do the fourfold or fivefold payment. But the Gemara rejects this answer as well. But what would be the law had the thief consecrated the animal as an offering of the most sacred order? Would he have to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment? If so, rather than teaching the following in the earlier clause of the Mishnah on page 78, in the case that stands in opposition to this one, if he stole an animal and he slaughtered it, and afterward he consecrated it, he must pay the fourfold or fivefold payment. So let the Tana distinguish and teach the opposing law within the same category itself in that Mishnah. And the Gemara elaborates, Tana could have taught, in what case is this statement that the thief is exempt if he consecrated the stolen animal and then slaughtered it or sold it? In what case is that said? It is said only if he consecrated the animal as an offering of lesser sanctity. But if he consecrated it as an offering of the most sacred order, he pays the fourfold or fivefold payment, as the consecration itself would be tantamount to sale to another party. I'm just about done. Stop on 76. Yeah, I'm getting close to done, so questions or comments, get them in, please. Rather, the Gemara states that actually there is no difference whether the thief consecrates the animal as an offering of the most sacred order, and there is no difference whether he consecrated as an offering of lesser sanctity. And as for the matter that presented a difficulty for you, namely, what difference is it to me if he sold the animal to an ordinary person, and what difference if he sold it to heaven, by way of this consecration, one can answer as follows. If someone, for example, Reuven, sold an ox to an ordinary person, for example, Shimon, at the outset, it was Reuven's ox, and now, after the sale, it is Shimon's ox. By contrast, if he sold it to heaven, meaning he consecrated it, so he consecrated it as an offering, it is not considered to have been transferred into the possession of another party, as at the outset it was Reuven's ox, and now, after the consecration, it is still in Reuven's possession for him to bring up and to get credit, as it were, for making the offering when the offering is made. So, where did the law end up on this discussion? One who steals consecrated property pays only the principal value of the stolen item. And this is also the law in the case of one who steals a sacrificial animal from its owner's house, regardless of whether the animal was designated as an offering of lesser sanctity or an offering of the most sacred order, and regardless of whether it was an animal concerning which the owner bears responsibility to replace it if it is lost. In all these cases, the thief is exempt from the double payment and from the fourfold or fivefold payment. And this law is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who distinguishes between animals and for which the owner bears responsible and those for not. So that's a different, the discussion moved on. That's a different law, right, than whether the thief himself makes a consecration and how that affects triggering the fourfold or fivefold payment versus if he stole an animal that the owner had already consecrated, and whether, that it's going to be triggering the fourfold or fivefold payment for that. Yes, and then the discussion continues on whether a consecrated animal that is blemished, either physically or through a defect in the sacrificial process, can trigger the fourfold or fivefold payment. Meaning, he stole a consecrated animal, let's say one that the owner is going to need to replace now that it's been stolen, but let's say that the animal that he stole is blemished and could not have been brought. Well, then the owner was going to have to replace it anyway. On the other hand, if he wasn't going to have to replace it, it was just an animal that he had designated to be brought as a sacrifice, but it was blemished, so it never could have been brought as a sacrifice, and the thief stole that, then what are the thief's obligations going to be? That's, part of that discussion. And so tomorrow we'll start our highlights with page 77, and we'll do, I guess, either 3 or 4 pages worth of highlights tomorrow. Okay, let's take a couple of questions. Come on, Google Docs, load. What is happening here? Okay, here we go. So Jonathan said, I was wondering what you all think about this example. A thief takes an animal, but then brings it to the temple for ritual offering. Seems to me this is not a very common thing, given that a thief denies the existence of God. Maybe in the case of teshuva, he does it and pays the appropriate fines. Seems very unlikely, though. All of these circumstances that we're talking about are highly unlikely. I mean, that somebody would steal an animal, okay, obviously that could happen. That he would steal an animal that had been consecrated, certainly that could happen. But as you say, a thief that steals an animal and then consecrates the animal and then feels bad about that and is caught, why are we really getting into these weird hypotheticals is to test the law, right? So definitely the fact that it may never happen in the real world is not what's relevant. Why they need consecration is to test our understanding of what slaughter and sale have in common with each other that would trigger the fourfold or fivefold payment. And the sages will help define what that quality is by saying, well, what if he removes it from his domain through consecration? Is that going to have the same effect as sale or slaughter? Now, Joseph says, I've been wanting to ask for a while. And by the way, what you said, Jonathan, very important. We're going to get to that in a few pages. Maybe you're on time, right? You're caught up. But this idea, and I think we've talked about it earlier in the tractate, the difference between a thief and a robber. That's what Jonathan was alluding to. Because a robber is, what is the difference between a thief and a robber? A thief is sneaky, right? He thinks that the owner won't see him, that no one will see him, and that's how he's able to get away with the theft. Whereas the robber is brazen and just, either with violence or the threat of violence or just intimidation, walks up to the victim and takes from him. So everyone knows who the robber is, as opposed to the thief who thinks he's going to get away with it. No one will know who he is. And it's only the thief that has the fourfold or fivefold payment. The robber, that doesn't apply. It's very interesting. You might think, well, isn't it worse, the armed robber? And we should ascribe that fourfold or fivefold payment to him. But the Torah just doesn't, it only legislates the fourfold or fivefold payment for the thief. So the question is, why did God write the Torah that way? And in later pages, the sages will speculate that the reason, now we don't know God's reasons, we just speculate, we try to figure it out, but we don't really know why God says one thing or not another. But the thought is that one who is brazen, okay, well, he's not afraid of God or people. He just, does what he wants to do because he's a robber. The thief is more afraid of people than of God, right? Because God knows everything that we do. So the thief thinks he's getting away with it because people didn't see him do it, even though obviously God saw him. So he has greater fear of people than he has of God. And the sage is saying that's why the Torah legislates the penalty of the fourfold or fivefold payment in the case of the thief and not the robber. Okay, question from Joseph. I've been wanting to ask for a while, why would the priests ever accept a stolen animal? Wouldn't they have some protocols to help discern a thief, like a line of preliminary questions before offering it? Would the priest be liable for not inquiring if it is suspicious? And before I answer, I think Bill offered an answer. I think we have to bear in mind how many animals are sacrificed any given day. There are daily sacrifices that are going to happen regardless. And on top of that, people are constantly, and Bill repeats, constantly, and I would agree, bringing offerings. I wouldn't be so crass as to describe anything involved with the Holy Temple as an industrial process, but in terms of sheer numbers, it does come close. And I would say that's exactly right. I mean, I don't think they had the time or resources to investigate, who got his animal where, right? They didn't have tracking devices. They didn't have licensing systems. They didn't really have collars. I don't know that the animals were branded, the way that we see in, like in Westerns and in Texas. I don't know. I think people probably still do it, right? People with big cattle herds brand their cattle. Although maybe modern times now they use electronic tracking devices. I don't know. But they did not investigate. So the question, and I'll say this, Joseph, even if you're right, and that there was some obligation on the part of, let's say, the temple administrators to ensure that a person was bringing an animal, that it wasn't stolen, it would not change this discussion, right? Because here they're just talking about what effect on the thief, what effect on the owner, what effect on penalty payments if an animal is brought as a sacrifice. And actually, we're not even talking so much if the animal is brought as a sacrifice. We've been talking more about consecration, right? Now, one view would be that in most circumstances you cannot consecrate a stolen animal. So the fact that you said the words of consecration won't have any effect. But under the view and under the circumstances where consecration has an effect, well, once an animal is consecrated, it can no longer be brought back into the workforce. It can't be brought back into the sheep herd, to be used for its wool or for its milk or for its meat. Or to be used as a lawnmower for that matter. Once it's consecrated, all those things are off the table. So if the thief's consecration is valid, then the owner has lost the use of that animal, and that's what really matters here, because the thief stole something that cannot be returned. Now, the interesting thing was, if the thief stole the animal, and then while it was in the thief's possession, it died, it fell in a hole and died, well, that was neither a sale nor a slaughter, right? So even though the animal can't be returned to the owner, the thief is going to have to make restitution, and he's going to have to make the double payment for the theft, if the theft is established by witnesses, but we're not going to do the fourfold or fivefold payment because he neither sold nor slaughtered it. Even though it died while in his possession and can't be returned, we're going to do one penalty, the twofold payment, but not the further penalty of the fourfold or fivefold payment. So I hope that helps clarify it a little bit. That's what we'll knock off for today. And tomorrow we'll continue with some more, multiple pages to help get us caught up.